when we have the official welcome, just to say, next slide, that we recognise, I think some of these animations put them all on. We recognise that some of the things that we're going to be talking about, not just in my session, but throughout the day, may be distressing for people. So really advocating for you to practice good self-care. So if it's upsetting, go out of the room. There are people who are here to provide support and can direct you to a counsellor, but just sometimes just being out of the space and this wonderful rooftop view that you can go and get. But also there's a network of Black and Asian therapists who are culturally informed practitioners. So if you want to engage with those, there's a link, but also people who probably can direct you further. Next one. So a bit about me, just so you know who I am. So this is my mummy, Miss Esmin O'Connor. So, and this is my dad, and Percival Monroe. And we're from next door to Liverpool. So we're not from Kingston. Everybody says they're from Kingston, but we're not. I'm a proud St. Catherine person. So for those of you who don't know, I think there's an arrow to point you to where it says it there. So you can't see from where you are, but this bit here, it says Spanish Town. So that, for those who don't know the history, that was the original capital of Jamaica when it was under Spanish occupation. But then it became Kingston. So it's fine, it's absolutely fine. So I'm a professor of mental health and inclusivity at the University of Manchester. And just a little bit about my research, just to put it in the context of what we're talking about today. So I started doing some work around depression in Black women, specifically women of Caribbean descent, and depression during and after pregnancy. And that's because nobody was doing it. So there's a lot of research that's been done, particularly amongst white women, and then increasingly amongst South Asian women, but there was nothing about Black women. We were literally missing from the information. Did some work for the government, writing a piece around Black, Asian, and other minoritized and racialized women, and why we were missing from all that information. And importantly, I also did some work around people in prisons. So some of you will remember there was a time, it's a bit different now, the population is slightly different, but there were lots of women from the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica, in our prisons who were recruited back in Jamaica and brought over as what they would call drug mules. So these were women who were recruited because they were pregnant, and they were seen to be less likely to be stopped when they came to customs, but of course that wasn't the case. So they'd end up, they had no history of drug or substance misuse or criminality or anything else, but they were stopped at Manchester Airport, and then they were transferred to Style Prison, which is where they would give birth. And it's important to put that into context, because what happened to those babies that were born then was that they had no status, they had no legal status, because their parents, their mum was a prisoner. And because they could only be, so Style was relatively unique. It's one of the very few prisons in the UK that had a mother and baby unit. And so some women could get placed in the mother and baby unit for them and their babies, but the maximum they could stay was 18 months. So after that, and these women tended to have sentences of like 7 years. So after that, or sometimes before that, they were placed with foster parents. So they were 7 years old, having been brought up in the UK, and then they were deported along with their mums at the end of their sentence, with no support when they got there. And bearing in mind, these were predominantly poor women from rural communities who were recruited, and now they're going home with a criminal record. They didn't get the money that they were supposed to have gotten to bring the drugs, and with a child who doesn't know them and doesn't know the country to which they're gone. Okay. Next one. Yeah, so we've done lots of other things, but probably the most recent thing, the next one, is to do some work looking at culturally informed family therapy for people diagnosed with schizophrenia and psychosis. So you probably know, some of you, that if you're of Caribbean descent in the UK, your risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia is about 7 times greater than if you're a white British person. If you're Black African, it's about 4 times. And for people of mixed heritage, it's somewhere in the middle, mixed African and Caribbean heritage. But nothing about the way people are treated when they're in care, in the service of the NHS and psychiatric services, none of that psychological therapy, if they're ever offered it, and they rarely are, but even when they are offered it, none of it is culturally informed. So let's watch the video. So that's just context for why I've been asked to talk a little bit about the harms of the Windrush scandal and some of the hidden harms. And I'm going to obviously talk a bit more about the mental health side, but it's really important to say, obviously, you know, we are made up of body, mind, soul, and spirit, right? So some of these, whatever these things happen, these traumatic experiences, they affect all of us, you know, as holistic beings. So if these things happen to you and your family members, as has happened, then it's not just that you are traumatized psychologically, but it has a physical impact. I heard earlier on about your sense of belonging. The Commission was saying, you know, to people who left the Caribbean, having been recruited to come to the motherland and serve the motherland, who believe themselves British because that's what they were when they left, and they came to the UK only to be told now they don't belong. All that work that they did to help build, you know, the NHS could never have been established without people that look like me and many of you in the room. So, we talk a lot about trauma, but I just thought it was important. So we spend a little bit of time talking about what exactly we mean. So there's a working definition. That trauma is, it's okay. So this is just one definition, right? There are many. So it's an emotional, physical, mental response to deeply distressing events that overwhelm a person's ability to cope, and that often results in lasting impact on their sense of safety and well-being, and importantly on their relationships and connections with others. So again, just briefly, some of the emotional, psychological and cognitive impacts are things like being really fearful and anxious, having nightmares and flashbacks, feeling hypervigilant, and some people use a psychiatric term of paranoia. But actually, when you know that people really are out to get you, then it really isn't paranoia, is it? And some of that for some people mean that they withdraw. They withdraw from society, they withdraw from their families, they don't know how to express what they're feeling, and there's a deep sense of shame. Because now what's happened is that people who have lived upright and just lives for their whole entire lives are now being criminalized. Confusion, anger, sadness, guilt, and when it feels overwhelming, a sense of hopelessness that you can't fight a system, can you? You can't do that on your own, or even with people. We've already heard that even when some of these cases get legal support and get right to the top, they are either rejected or you know, sometimes they're getting a nil award. So for all the trauma that people have experienced, it's still not being recognised and compensated. So very much like PTSD is what people experience. And then on the physical side, this takes its toll. So, you know, we are made up of body, mind, soul, and spirit. And so anything that's affecting you psychologically is going to affect your body. And so people are having high rates of things like hypertension, high blood pressure, headaches, palpitations. A lot of these, which seems like maybe like trivial symptoms on their own, but altogether what they're talking about, what they're showing is a stress response, which can show itself up in both psychological and physical. And behavioural, so people end up not being able to sleep, and having problems with eating, either overeating to compensate or under-eating because they can't take up food. So it's all kinds of physical manifestations. Okay, just moving on. Oh, I can't see number one. I don't know why that's cut off. I don't know why that's cut off. Anyway, but it's so we talk about trauma. And I just really wanted to say that, you know, obviously there's physical trauma, so if you went outside and fell downstairs, God forbid, that you'd get physical trauma. But even without physical, there's likely to be a psychological impact of that. But we're going to focus on the psychological. So, you can have, so these are different levels, and I can't see the top one, but never mind. I'm not quite sure why it's cut off, because I want you to see why. Let's see. Don't worry. Talk amongst yourselves. There you go. Okay, so leave it there for a moment. So, you know, I just mentioned that example of falling downstairs. That's an acute trauma, right? So something that's really happened, you've hurt yourself, and you know that could be any other form of trauma. So it's distressing, but it's a single one-off event, and you can recover bounce back from that. But there are other forms of trauma that happen over time, so they become chronic and repeated. And so things like domestic violence is one of those. And I would say that what's happened to many of the people who've been affected by the Windrush falls under that. So they're re-traumatized continually by different events. And then what you also have is that they then have this interplay with the complex trauma, where it's not just the event, but all the other things it signifies. So you will know that people who were caught up in this scandal, and that's what it is, lost things like their right to use NHS, their rights to pensions, they lost so many other things for which they worked and contributed. So that means that what you then have is this complex interpersonal trauma. And so that this is where it's not just about the person themselves, but all the other people around them. Your family feel helpless, they can't help you, they don't know how to help you. The people in the church were trying to help, and your communities, maybe people who've gone back to their primary schools to try and get school records. So there are lots of other people who are caught up trying to help, and then it becomes, over time, quite a complex process. And then you have, so on here it talks about therapists and first responders, but the first responders in this instance are the families and the neighbours and the church members, those people who are seeing what's happening to somebody and feel helpless that they can't do anything about it. And then adverse childhood experiences, which we know can predispose people to going on to have serious and complex mental health issues. So imagine this is your granddad is one of those, or your grandma is one of those people who's lived here all her life, you've known her all her life, and then suddenly you can't see her anymore because you wake up one day and she's not even in the country. And no one can explain why she's in a place called Barbados that you barely heard about other than in stories. And that's where she's gone. Okay, next one please. So that's about the adverse childhood experiences. It's just really to say that this doesn't stop with the Windrush generation. It has, in the work that I do, which is psychological therapies and psychological impacts, it goes on to their families and to not just their next generation, but their grandchildren and beyond. And there are lots of different types of trauma, so we'll move past maybe the first two lots. And I really want us to think about this vicarious trauma in relating to what I've just been saying. Because very often when people talk about trauma and trauma-informed response, they're talking about people like the police or people going into burning buildings to go and rescue folk. Okay, and that's obvious, isn't it? That you're doing that and you get traumatized. So people who worked at Grenfell, for example, were the first responders who were traumatized. But if you watch what was happening to your grandma, or your granddad, or your mum, or your dad, or your auntie, and they were being forcibly evicted from your family home and then taken away, that's traumatic. That's vicarious trauma. You witness that, and you're powerless to do anything to stop it. That's really important. That sense that there is nothing you can do to stop this happening to people that you love and care for. And then we've got the other one, collective trauma. So many of us in this space, all our lives, have experienced race-based trauma in one form or another. For some of us it's been much more in your face, others it's more subtle in terms of employment and housing and other things. But actually, when you move on to these things like forced displacement, that's what's happened to people who have been shipped. Some of them came as children. They have no memory of Barbados or Jamaica. And then suddenly, that's where they are. Okay? So just think about that and about the people who are left behind. And really, it's important to see it's in that same category as being affected by war. So it's a collective violence that's been done to our communities. And I think people don't really understand that, but don't really understand the sense of how it destabilizes your sense of who you are and your belonging. And that is really important for your mental health and well-being. Okay, next. So what can we do to repair the harms? Just put them all up. Okay, so I think it's important to say that we need to have properly resourced sustainable, long-term responses. So at the moment it's a bit piecemeal. Some people are not going for care because they're frightened of being deported still. When they go into the services, actually a lot of the services are not set up to provide culturally appropriate, culturally informed care, and they don't really understand all this Windrush stuff anyway. They've heard about it, but they don't understand. So the chances of somebody from the NHS, a regular practitioner, even well-meaning and well-intentioned, being able to provide the care that people need are pretty slim. So we need proper systems that are set up to deliver the care that people need. So it needs to be trauma-informed, it needs to be culturally appropriate. The extent to which the NHS can provide that, I don't know, questionable, but that's what the NHS is. And the irony that the people who came to help to establish the NHS now cannot, and they and their descendants cannot receive the care that they need from the NHS, shouldn't be lost on any of us. There's a lot of people in the voluntary sector, so African and Caribbean mental health services and other groups like that who do a lot of this work, but they tend to be doing it on a shoestring and they're living hand to mouth. Often their services, they're precarious. Faith communities who do their best, but again, not necessarily with the psychological understanding, but we could do stuff more in partnerships, right? Thinking about how the voluntary sector, the NHS, and those faith communities and voluntary sector groups could come together to actually make sure that people get this psychological support that they need. And we need better research, and I would say that one time, like an academic, but we do, because we don't really know how many people are affected, and by that, we still don't know about the ripples. So we know about some of the people who've lost their status, but there's their children, their grandchildren, communities that they serve. Some of these people are pillars of their communities and still are, so we need to understand that. We need to understand how these things manifest. So we don't, there's no one response, okay, to trauma. It comes in many different forms, and we need to understand that. And then we need to think about what are the best interventions that we can deliver as of the NHS, as a collective, and who's going to pay for that? So at the moment, there's nothing. There's no proper scheme to which people who are affected by Windrush can go to and say, my mental health has been affected and there isn't a scheme set up to actually address people's mental health needs. But it costs. So there's a cost for action, but there's also a cost for inaction, and that comes in many forms. So there's going to be the traumatization of the people who are directly affected as being people from the Windrush, but then there's their children, their grandchildren, there are people in the communities to which they belong who are being vicariously affected because they see how easy it is for somebody who's helped to build this country to lose everything overnight, and that destabilizes your sense of well-being. Okay. So that's me if you want to get in touch with me, but I'm just going to finish just by reading something for you, which some of you might have heard before. So this is a poem that's written by my friend and colleague, Professor Laura Serrett, and it's called "You Call and We Came." And I think it's really important for us to remember that people like my parents came because they felt it was their duty to come and help to rebuild the motherland. And people like Enoch Powell and Douglas Home, who then would want people to go back to where they came from, were the ones who came to the Caribbean and told them that it was their duty and their responsibility to come and build the motherland. So this is what this poem is. So Laura is a nurse by background from Dominique, and this is a poem. It's called "You Call and We Came." You called and we came, in ships bigger than anything we'd seen, dwarfing our islands and covering them in the shadows of smoke and noise. Crowded, excited voices filled the air, traveling to the motherland. Over weeks, over oceans that threatened to engulf us, driven by a wish, a call to save, to rebuild and support efforts to establish health for all in the aftermath of war. You called and we came. Women and men of position in our homelands, nurses with a pride in the excellence of our care, with experiences of management, organisation, and a sense of duty. We appeared, smiling and eager to work on the wards, communities, and clinics of this England. You called and we came. Our big hearts, skillful hands, and quick minds, encased in our skins of a darker hue, which had shimmered and glowed in our sunnier climes, but now signified our difference, our unbelonging. Matrons became assistants, nurses became chambermaids, and all the while striving to fulfill our promise, to succor, to serve, and to care. You called, and we came. The blue of the sisters' uniform seemed as far away from us as the moon, unreachable by our dark hands in this cold land. But we were made of sterner stuff. The hot sun, which once had beaten down on our ancestors when they too left their lands, shone within us, forging our hearts and minds with a resistance of ebony. You called, and we came, rising like the phoenix from the heat of rejection. We cared, we worked, and we organized until the quickness of our brains and the excellence of our care made it hard for you to contain us. And slowly, so slowly, the blue uniforms had dark and lighter bodies beneath them. The professional care in our touch was valued despite the strongness of our speech, or strangeness of our speech, and the kinks in our hair. You called, and we came. A new millennium, new hopes spread across the land. New populations engaging and reflecting the varied, diverse, and vibrant nature of these shores. Challenging and reflecting our leadership for health. Moves to melt the snow at the tops of the peaks of our profession. Recognizing the richness of our kaleidoscope nation, where compassion, courage, and diversity are reflected. In our presence and in our contribution, not only the hopes and dreams of our ancestors, human values needed to truly lead, change, and add value. Remember, you called. Remember, you called. You called. Remember, it's us who came.